Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at the impact of war on Britain. In particular, we're looking at World War I and World War II bombing raids and the impact that those bombing raids had on Britain at the time. So we'll start by looking at World War I, and the main bombing raids that occurred during World War I were the Zeppelin raids. So we're going to have a look at those. So, World War I bombing. How much impact did this have on Britain and why? Well, the main type of attack that we've mentioned is Zeppelin attacks. British civilians experienced a new threat during World War I that they hadn't experienced before, and that was direct attacks from the enemy in the form of bombing raids. It was January 1915 when the first Zeppelins began bombing raids on British cities, and their main target was London. So if you're looking at sources, one thing to consider might be the impact of Zeppelin raids might be greater in some areas than in other areas. So some people might not be scared by them, and other people might be absolutely terrified and feel that it was an imminent threat. London had a strict blackout regulations in place to try and stop the Zeppelin attacks. So that was blocking all forms of light to try and stop the enemy from being able to spot heavily populated areas. The public became angry when there was little defence against the raids. The first Zeppelin to be shot down wasn't until September 1916. And when you consider that Zeppelin raids started in January 1915, you can see why people might be quite angry, because that's over a year that they've had these Zeppelin raids on and off in those areas. The last Zeppelin raid was in 1917, and the reason that Zeppelin raids stopped at this point was because better searchlights were made to be able to find Zeppelins in the sky, so they'd have literally lamps shining up out of the dark to try and spot the Zeppelins, and the searchlights made it very easy to spot those huge floating airships. If a Zeppelin was shot, then it burst into flames and the crew had little chance of survival. So once they were able to spot them, they were quite easy to shoot down. Over 500 people were killed in Zeppelin raids in World War I, and over another 1,300 were injured as well. So large numbers of people were affected, but nothing in comparison to the numbers that we'll see in World War II bombing raids. German bombing raids. It's also worth considering that from May 1917, the Germans began to use an aircraft known as a Gotha 4 bomber. So once the Zeppelin raids weren't really working, they changed to using Gotha 4 bombers. These could only carry small bombs, but they were capable of destroying a few houses. So they didn't just stop bombing in World War I after the Zeppelins were easily shot down in 1917. They switched to these Gotha bombers. The raids caused a great deal of panic. British civilians had never experienced bombing on this scale before, and the loss of life was high as people could not protect themselves as there were no shelters in World War I. In one raid in June 1917, 162 civilians were killed and over 400 were injured. So the Gotha bombers in many ways were much scarier to people than the Zeppelins had been, as that's just one raid. Public pressure forced the government to bring in better searchlights, balloons and anti-aircraft guns. And as a result, 7 out of the 19 Gotha bombers were shot down on the 19th of May in a raid. And the Germans couldn't afford that kind of loss. They couldn't afford to keep rebuilding Gotha bomber aircrafts. And as a result, they called off all further raids. So it wasn't a particularly long time that the Gotha bombers were used for. Despite this, the civilian experience of bombing was nothing like that experience in World War II. The majority of raids only actually affected, like we've mentioned above, the southeast of England. So you might want to consider differences perhaps in sources you see, why some people might feel more scared than others. Maybe look at the dates of the sources that you might be looking at. Is it before or after May 1917? In which case it might be a different type of aircraft that people are talking about. Perhaps more civilians and houses might be killed and destroyed by a Gotha bomber, for example, than a Zeppelin aircraft. Some of them might have been harder to shoot down than others. Both cases, the Zeppelins and the Gotha bombers, it was public pressure which eventually forced the government to take action. And in both cases, it's investment in things like searchlights and anti-aircraft guns that helped to reduce the impact that it might have. So let's now have a look at World War II, the Blitz and V1 and V2 raids, and the impact of bombing in World War II. Okay, well, it's well known that in World War II, the key raids that we saw, or bombing raids that we saw that would have had an impact on people would have been the Blitz. German bombing raids in World War II were far more serious than they had been in World War One. Better technology allowed bombers to fly further and drop larger and more destructive bombs. The German bombing attacks became known as the Blitz and started on the 7th of September 1940. The aim of the Blitz was to destroy the morale of the people so that they would persuade their own government to surrender. The Blitz also aimed to destroy key industrial areas, so any kind of major cities where there might be factories, and communications as well. So any areas where there might be radar or radio communication were aimed at to be destroyed by the German bombers to try and limit Britain's ability to fight the war. From May 1941, the bombing raids became less frequent, and Hitler turned his attention instead to the invasion of the USSR, as you might know it, Russia. So one of the key reasons why bombing raids end in World War II is because Hitler changes his attention and changes his focus. He obviously doesn't think he's getting very far with the Blitz, or perhaps he thinks it's had the impact that it's going to already. So from May 1941, he's more interested in the invasion of Russia or the USSR, so he stops bombing so frequently in Britain. Definitely something to consider then would be the date of the source that you're looking at. If it's between the 7th of September 1940 and May 1941, that sort of period of about a year, then you'd expect people to be perhaps more scared and terrified by the Blitz than you might after that point, because the raids would have become less frequent. So something else to consider as well would be where sources that you're looking at might have been written. Because certain cities and towns were affected more than others. Now, there are cities and towns all over Britain that were affected and targeted by the Blitz. The main target was definitely London. It was bombed every single night from the 7th of September to the 2nd of November 1940, which obviously is an extremely frightening period for the people of London. The East End was especially badly hit, especially the dock area where the ships would come in and out. The key reason that the Germans might have targeted that is obviously that's a key area for trade and for getting supplies in and out of the country. 12,500 people died in December 1940 alone in London. So the scale of how many people, how many citizens were being affected by the bombing raids is much greater in World War II, you can see, just in that 1 month than it had been for the entire period of World War I. In the south, the ports of Bristol, Plymouth, Portsmouth and Southampton were also targeted. Naval bases at Portsmouth was a target for a massive attack on the 10th of January 1940, where 930 civilians died. And Coventry was also subject to a huge attack on the 14th of November 1940. The whole city centre was almost totally destroyed. Incendiary bombs were used to create total destruction. So bombs that were catching fire. Many people fled the town at night and slept in the fields to try and avoid bombing. Accounts at the time, however, suggest that they returned each morning and continued to work. So there is this idea of Blitz spirit. Some people believe that everyone was on board and still really enthusiastic to try and support their country. Other people think that's a bit of a myth and that morale was in fact actually very low. We'll look at that a little bit more later. Also, other cities in the north of England to consider would be things like Manchester and Liverpool, which were also targeted by bombing raids during the Blitz. A raid on Liverpool destroyed a ship loaded with explosives, and the resulting explosion destroyed a large part of Liverpool docks. Glasgow and the shipyards on Clyde were also badly hit, and so too were the shipyards in Belfast. Here, 150,000 people were made homeless. So actually, in most of the major cities, you would expect to see sources and people talking about their fears or the number of houses destroyed or people killed. And in each time you'd expect to see, hundreds of thousands of people being killed, or at least a minimum of around 1,000 people being killed by those bombing raids, very sadly. If you're looking at sources perhaps from the countryside or a long time after this period in the 1940s, 1941, then perhaps you might see a different kind of picture of the impact of the Blitz. Also, to consider in World War II, it's not just the Blitz, there's also the V1 and V2 raids. So the V1 and V2 raids were a new type of rocket. So these were used in 1944 and 1945 towards the very end of the war. The V1 was a flying bomb, which was also sometimes called a doodlebug, and it could fly a certain distance and was then dropped when it ran out of fuel. And although these were hard to control, they did cause some damage. So around 6,000 of the V1 rockets, also known as doodlebugs, reached their targets, causing 20,000 casualties. So the Blitz wasn't the only period in World War II where you'd see fear of bombing raids. The V2 was a more serious threat than the V1. These could fly at supersonic speed and couldn't actually be seen or shot down. They were the first guided missiles, and about 500 of these hit London in 1945. So the V2 rocket was probably the scariest of all of the bombs or the bombing threats because they had no warning. So whereas during the Blitz you'd have the air raid sirens going off and people would have some kind of warning of danger, imminent danger coming, or the doodlebugs making the sort of whistling sounds so people could hear them coming, the V2 couldn't be heard or seen. So that was probably an even scarier period in London in 1945. In terms of the effects that these bombings had in World War II, a key effect would have been on industry. Bombing didn't disrupt industry as much as the Germans had hoped. Many factories were on the outskirts of towns rather than in the centre of them, and often were actually on their own, which made them hard targets to spot, especially because of blackout conditions. Bombing wasn't very accurate in World War II. Most factories that were hit were actually able to resume production within a few days. So actually the impact on factories was relatively minimal. The effects on civilians were much more severe. Homes, businesses, cars and trains all had to be blacked out. So on a daily basis, people would have been affected by the bombing raids. You can see someone painting their cow to try and make it look like it will stand out less during the daytime, or sorry, rather in the nighttime. So these things probably would have had a greater impact on everyday life of civilians. People took the blackout very seriously. There are reports of neighbours stoning the windows of houses where the blackout was regularly ignored. So that's sort of neighbours taking the law into their own hands and trying to punish their neighbours if their neighbours weren't careful enough to block out every little bit of light and turn their lights out at night. Because that might cause their area to be at threat of bombing raids. The number of accidents increased, especially at night time. The number of car accidents doubled and many pedestrians were injured because in trying to not use lights at night, it would be much more difficult to avoid accidents. The edges of pavements were painted white and so were the lampposts to try and help people find their way. Even cows were sometimes painted with white stripes so that they wouldn't be hit at night time. The effects on civilians, also we've got to consider things like shelters. So in World War I there weren't really any shelters built. In World War II there is an attempt to do so. Not everyone would have had access to this, so we've already heard above about some people going into fields to try and, in the countryside, to try and sleep there because they thought they'd be less at risk there. But there were also people who could people could also buy shelters. So one of the earliest forms of shelter was an Anderson shelter. These were dug into the garden, if you had a garden of course, and provided protection from flying glass and shrapnel. They didn't protect against direct hit though, but they saved many lives. So if a bomb actually landed on top of your Anderson shelter, sort of dug into the ground, you can see an example here, then if it lands on your Anderson shelter, your Anderson shelter would collapse, it wouldn't actually protect you. But if it landed near your Anderson shelter, then you would be protected from further injury, so you wouldn't get killed by flying pieces of shrapnel and that sort of thing. So it was better than nothing. People who didn't have a garden did have an option as well, so you could buy something called a Morrison shelter, and you can see just about an example here. It's a sort of metal table, if you like, with a cage around the sides. It was a metal table that provided some protection. If your house collapsed, it would stop all the rubble from squashing you. Only 27% of people in the country used private shelters or self-chosen shelters. So that's just a smidgen over a quarter That means nearly 75% or 3/4 of the people in the UK actually didn't use private shelters. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about how useful sources are or how much they reveal to us about the ways that bombing raids affected people in Britain during World War II. Most Londoners chose to shelter in places like the Underground, where the trains were. The government didn't want people sheltering here to begin with. They thought it might spread panic and lead to great numbers of people together, and that they were concerned people might refuse to come back out of the Underground in the morning. People tried to keep cheerful in the Underground, having sing-songs. Canteens provided hot food and drinks. And many people enjoyed the companionship, but the conditions were very crowded. On one night, for example, you might expect to see 177,000 people sheltered in the Underground. So it wouldn't all be fun and games. It might be really overcrowded, and you might still hear the air raid sirens and things like that from above, and that could be very scary. Other public shelters also existed, so obviously only 1/4 of people roughly had their private shelters. So public shelters, we've got the Underground, which people just chose to do themselves rather than the government telling them to, but there were public shelters, especially in areas where few houses and gardens had Anderson shelters. Schools also had their own air raid shelters. One of the worst accidents of the war was when a bomb fell on a shelter in a school in London and over 400 children were killed. So again, that shows, even though they were building these shelters, the shelters were almost more of a morale thing than necessarily something that could protect people. If a bomb dropped directly on the shelters, then the people inside of it still would have been killed. We've got on the 10th of September 1940, a bomb hit Buckingham Palace. Even though the damage was slight, people were impressed at the attitude of the royal family, who insisted on staying at Buckingham Palace throughout the war. So that was quite good for morale of the people in London. If you've got the Queen and the King and the family that were there all staying put, then that made everyone else feel that they must be safe and it must be okay to keep calm and carry on working and trying to fight the war as a civilian. The Blitz spirit, so we mentioned this briefly before, and just to finish this revision video off, let's have a quick think about the Blitz spirit. So the media tried to show that bombing was not having its main aim, it wasn't achieving its main aim, which was to destroy the morale of the people and force them to persuade the government to surrender. Newspaper stories, radio programmes and films were all therefore aimed at persuading people that bombing was not breaking people's spirits and that Britain could survive the bombing raids. People seemed cheerful in the face of great hardships and determined to get on with everyday life. Although people did take the attitude, there is evidence that the Blitz spirit was not always felt. Sources not published during the wars show that mass panic in the face of heavy bombing raids people did feel, and that people didn't really feel that they could last much longer. Censorship and propaganda was very effective at playing down the negative reactions of individuals or groups that were badly affected by bombings. So you might see mocking of people who were panicking because they're trying to stop people from panicking and make that seem like it's a silly idea. You might see an absence of sources talking about panic or a low morale because of heavy censorship during World War II. And you might see more of a wealth of sources looking at positive stories and trying to make people feel that they're able to get through the war, and that the royal family is still there and that it's something that they can all survive. So that's the end of this quick revision video looking at the impact of war, in particular bombing raids in World War I and World War II on Britain. Good luck with your revision.